Welcome to week 11, or I'm sorry, week 10 of American History Hybrid. This week we're going to take a look at the major theme of the Great Depression. At the conclusion of these notes, just like as the previous 9 weeks, you should be able to answer the following learning objectives. 1. Summarize the critical problems threatening American society in the late 1920s. That should read 1920s. 2. Describe the causes of the stock market crash and the Great Depression. 3. Explain how the Great Depression affected the economy in the U.S. and throughout the world. 4. Describe how people struggled to survive the Great Depression. 5. Explain how the Depression affected men, women, and children. 6. Explain how Hoover's initial response to the Great Depression. 7. Summarize the actions Hoover took to help the economy and the hardships suffered by the Americans. And lastly, describe the Bonus Army and Hoover's actions towards the Bonus Army. The nation's sick economy is the heading for these notes. All right, first, economic troubles emerge in the 1920s. Serious problems threatening economic prosperity. Though some Americans became wealthy, many could not earn a decent living. Some important industries struggled, and farmers grew more crops and raised more livestock than they ever did before with minimal profit, which led to the farming crisis. Both consumers and farmers were steadily growing deeper and deeper into debt. As the decade drew to a close, these slippages in the economy signaled the end of an era. We look at industries in trouble. We look at both the mining and labor struggle, the key basic industries such as railroads and textiles and steel barely made a profit. Meanwhile, the mining and lumbering industries, which had expanded during the wartime, were no longer in high demand. Coal mining was especially hard hit in part due to the stiff competition from new forms of energy, specifically hydroelectric power, fuel, oil, and natural gases. By the early 1930s, these sources of supplies accounted for more than half the energy and half the energy from coal. Even the boom industries in the 1920s, such as the automobiles, construction, and consumer goods, even weakened. Housing markets started to fall, and so did jobs. We see with the falling of housing markets and jobs, we also see consumers spending less money. Although the expectation due to consumerism is that every family should try to keep up with the Joneses, and thus still wanting some of the luxurious amenities that are available during this time, and they borrow money or they borrow on credit. So many live on what is known as credit. In other words, live on paycheck to paycheck, or some cases in debt. And we also see during this time the federal government calls on a price support system. Government would buy surplus crops for the farmers that were in crisis and guarantee prices and sell them on a world market. However, Coolidge, the president in the second part of the 1920s, vetoed the bill twice. With consumers having less to spend, again, this increases the rises of prices of consumer goods. It creates stagnant wages for workers, and thus a growing uneven distribution of income across America. Again, the poor people overbuying on credit, meanwhile the people that are wealthy not having to buy on credit, resulting in a huge, even widening gap between rich and poor. Living on credit, usually living beyond their means. They bought their goods in credit and ranged in which some consumers agreed to buy now and pay later for purchases. This was often in the form of the installment plans, which we talked about last week. The uneven distribution of income, as the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. More than 70% of the nation's families earned less than $2,500 per year. This was considered the minimum amount needed for a decent standard of living. Hoover takes the nation on the elections in 1928. Hoover was the former Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge. His characteristics were quiet and reserved. He was a president from Iowa. Many Americans believed him when he declared, "We in America are near to the final triumph over poverty than ever before." But during this time, Some economists had warned of the weakening economy, but most Americans maintained the utmost confidence in the nation's economic health. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was the most widely used barometer of the stock market's health. The Dow measured stocks of the 30 most representative large firms that traded on the New York Stock Exchange. During the 1920s, economists said the economy was in what is known as a bull market, a period of rising stock prices. So Americans begin to rush to buy stocks and bonds. It seems as though everything was going up in price. Many Americans during this time could not afford buying stocks, so what they did is they bought on the margin, paying a small percentage of the stock's price as a down payment and borrowing the rest. With this easy money, coupled with speculators are people who bought stocks and bonds on the change of a quick profit, ignoring the risks. Speculation and buying the margins are going to be two of four main causes to the Great Depression. We'll also see a rise. Rises in prices did not reflect the company's worth during this time. Even worse is if the value of the stock declined, people who had bought on the margin had no way to pay off the loans. Again, an image, a political cartoon of buying in the margin and speculation. Stock market crashes in 1929. The stock market on October 29th, known as Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out of the market. The nation's confidence in stockholders frantically tried to sell before prices plunged even lower. The number of shares dumped was a record. 16.4 million shares were dumped. Additional millions of shares could not find buyers. People who had bought the stocks in credit were stuck with huge debts as the prices plummeted, while others lost most of their savings. Created a financial collapse. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression. The Great Depression are known as the years between 1929 to 1940, again before U.S. enters World War II. We'll see bank and businesses fail. After the crash, many people panicked and withdrew their money from the banks, but some couldn't get their money because the banks had invested in the stock market. In 1929, 600 banks had closed. By 1933, 4 years into the Great Depression, 11,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks had failed. The Great Depression hit businesses as well. Between 1929 and 1932, the gross domestic national product, the nation's total output of goods and services, was cut nearly in half. Approximately 90,000 businesses went bankrupt. This also resulted in high unemployment rates. High unemployment, it leaped from 3%, in other words, 1.6 million people in 1929, to 25%. Nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans were unemployed by 1933. Again, this will have a worldwide effect. It won't just affect the United States, it'll have an effect on Europe. European countries tried to recover from the ravages of World War I, facing high war debts. Also, Germany had to pay reparations to the Allies. And the Great Depression compounded these problems by limiting America's ability to import European goods. This made it difficult to sell American farm products and manufactured goods abroad. The causes of the Great Depression, many historians will agree there are 4 main causes. The first is tariffs and war debt policies that cut down on the foreign market for American goods. Second is the crisis in the farm sector. Third is the availability of easy credit or buying on margin. And the fourth is an unequal distribution of income. Some will also say the federal government contributed to the crisis by keeping interest rates low, thereby allowing companies and individuals to borrow easily and to build up large debts. Hardships and suffering during the Great Depression. Again, we're looking at men, women, and children. During this time, shanty towns emerge. Shanty towns are going to be little towns consisting of shacks, corrugated roofs that sprang up all over the United States near major cities. Also, we see soup kitchens, which offered free and low-cost food, and they also offered bread lines, or charitable organizations or public agencies became a common sight within these shanty towns. Racial violence again emerges during this time. The high unemployment rate is going to lead whites and nativists to compete for jobs, thus blaming African Americans, as well as minority ethnic groups like the Latino and Southwest, where they demanded the deportation of Latinos and Hispanics. But also we see in 1933, nearly 24 African Americans died by lynching. The Depression also affected rural areas slightly different. One of the things rural areas could do is they could bring about growing food for themselves. In other words, subsistent living. Meanwhile, 400,000 farms closed through foreclosure during this time. And then we see the Dust Bowl begin in the early 1930s. It wreaked havoc on the Great Plains. You can see the picture right here, the dark red, which is known as the Texas Panhandle, had the most drastic effect. But really, it stretched from Texas to North Dakota, where grasslands and plants millions of acres of new farmland. What they did is they plowed and removed the thick protective layer of prairie grasses. Farmers had then exhausted the land through overproduction of crops. When they overproduced these crops and excavated the land, it created little grass and few trees were left to hold the soil down. So then a windstorm in 1934 picked up millions of tons of dust from the plains and carried it as far as some accounts to the East Coast. This became known as the Great Dust Bowl. The Great Dust Bowl will affect farmers and sharecroppers. Many will have to pack up and leave their belongings and head west. Some of these migrants that traveled the route of Route 66 to California were known as the Okies. Again, from this Oklahoma, Texas Panhandle region, they'll take the Highway 66 into California to seek opportunities. Effects on the American family. In some cases, it brought together family unity. When money was tight, many families entertained themselves by playing board games such as Monopoly, which was invented in 1933. They listened to the radio. They worked as a family to make ends meet with the daily struggles. But in some cases, families broke apart under these strains. Men, often the breadwinners during this time, had to seek employment, so oftentimes they would be grooming the streets in search for jobs. Oftentimes they wouldn't find jobs and they'd be discouraged by the limited number of jobs available. And in some cases they would turn to hobos and abandon their family. In fact, during the Great Depression, Holt cites that 300,000 transient or hobos emerges during the early 1930s. During this time, there was no federal system or direct relief, which is cash payments or food provided by the government for the people that struggle or the poor. This also brought about women to return to cottage industrial ways of life, where they would can foods and make clothing for their families. The social and psychological effect during the first 4 years of the Great Depression, Holt cites that 30%, the suicide rate had rose 30%. We see people stopped going to doctors and dentists because they couldn't afford it. Others put off marriage, raising large families, or having children at all, as you can see with this line graph here. Thriftiness, again, is encouraged through parsimonious saving and spending habits. And then with that being said, they also come together with kindness of strangers by sharing resources and cooperating together. Again, bringing community closer together. All right, Hoover struggles with the Depression. Herbert Hoover, really what he tells Americans is to remain optimistic. Lack of confidence in the economic future is foolish. That was a quote from Hoover. And he also believed that government could play a very minimal role in helping solve this economic problem. What we do see with Hoover is he fosters cooperation among competing group and interest groups. He facilitates cooperation, but he doesn't control it. What he does call Americans, but what he does mostly encourage is for Americans to take an approach that epitomizes rugged individualism, the idea that people should succeed through their own efforts. And he really opposed any direct form of federal welfare. What we do see is he will take cautious steps, working with businesses and banking leaders, laborers, urging them to work together to find solutions for this economic crisis. One project that Hoover does approve that does make a difference is the creation of the Boulder Dam, which becomes later known as the Hoover Dam, which is the damming of the Colorado River. Hoover proposed that the finances the dam's construction, the finances used for the construction would be paid by the revenue generated for electric power that the dam would generate through hydroelectric power energy. The construction of the dam, again, is going to provide electricity and flood control to regulate water supply in the massive California agricultural economy. Today, when we look at the dam, it also helps provide water to cities such as Los Angeles and Las Vegas. However, this leads to an opening for the Democrats to control one of the two houses in the Senate. They take the majority of the seats in the House of Representatives, and they're only one vote or one seat short of the Senate majority. During this time, some farmers call on a farmer holiday and they refuse to work for their fields. A number of block roads to prevent food from getting to the markets, hoping that the food shortage would raise prices. Some farmers also use force to prevent authorities from foreclosing on their farms. Hoovervilles were the shanty towns I referred to earlier in the notes. The shanty towns, again, those dilapidated buildings set up in major cities, were mimicked as Hoover towns or Hoovervilles, a direct slap on the President Hoover's policies during this time. Homeless people called the newspaper. What they did is they called the newspapers. They wrapped themselves in Hoover blankets. Empty pockets turned inside out were known as Hoover flags. Many Americans who had hailed Hoover as a great humanitarian a few years earlier saw him as a cold and heartless leader for his lack of direct relief for the poor. However, Hoover does take action. We saw with the Boulder Dam, he encourages cooperation. We see also he creates the Federal Farm Board, an organization of farming cooperatives. Members join together to buy crops and keep them off the market temporarily until the prices arose, so never oversupplying the market. He also creates we see a direct intervention. That's the creation of the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowered mortgage rates for homeowners and allowed farmers to refinance their farm loans and avoid foreclosure. So again, we see in the picture right here, trying to refinance to avoid foreclosing on his farm. However, we also see the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was approved by Congress, which authorized $2 billion for emergency financing for banks, life insurance companies, railroads, and other large businesses. However, these efforts were too little too late. The demise for Hoover is soon to come. The Bonus Army, Hoover's known as gassing the Bonus Army. What the Bonus Army is comprised of, it's expatriates of World War I. The Bonus Army came to the nation's capital to support a bill. The bill was the Patman Bill, which authorized the government to pay a bonus to World War I veterans. Congress had approved the bill in 1924. The Congressman Wright Patman, who wrote the bill, believed that each World War I veteran should receive on average $500 per soldier, and they should be paid immediately. Well, the Bonus Army was not paid immediately, so they stormed to Washington, D.C., where they set up makeshift houses, or in other words, shanty shacks in D.C. And Hoover ordered for their evacuation. There are approximately 2,000 people of this Bonus Army that wanted to meet with the president, and they refused to budge. And again, the president orders that the Bonus Army should disband immediately. However, not all of them disband. About 1,000 soldiers are encouraged by President Hoover during this time, led by Douglas MacArthur as well as Major Dwight D. Eisenhower. where they were given permission by the president for the infantry to gas more than the 1,000 people that remained in these shanty towns. This gassing did not just affect the bonus army; it affected um, young children, 11-month-old baby, an 8-year-old boy, um, and 2 people were shot and many were injured. Most Americans were stunned in outrage at the government's treatment of the veterans. President Hoover's image is um, has suffered, and the American public is going to look for a new leader for the nation. That is the end of Week 10's notes. Again, review the learning outcomes and start Week 10's activity.